Hello and welcome. Now, Africa stands on the cusp of a transformation that I think may forever change the fortunes of the continent for the better. Now, the formal beginning of trading under the African Continental Free Trade Area in July promises to usher in, I think, a new chapter in the continent's storied history, marking its strongest attempt yet to create the continent, the one continent promised by the independence fathers such as Kwame Nkrumah. So, after the 33rd session of the African Union, we are asking the question, are we there yet? Well, I have an eminent panel with me here to talk about the outcomes of that summit here in the studio with me. And of course, we're speaking to that key theme that was overarching over everything else, silence the guns, creating conducive conditions for Africa's development. Let me introduce my guests. I begin in Addis Ababa, the political capital city, let me put it that way, of Africa, where we're joined by Dr. Tapiwa Nyasulu Uchizi Reyamu, Head Gender Analysis and Monitoring Division at the African Union. Here in the studio, I have with me the director of, actually I've got my order quite wrong. Let me make sure I get it right. Mxolisi Nkosi, Deputy Director General, Global Governance and Continental Agenda in South Africa. Thank you, sir, for coming. We also have Dr. Petros Adikok. He is General Manager of Research at Brand SA. And also with us in the studio, I have Claudia Furiel. She's Director of NEPAD at South Africa's Department of Trade and Industry. And last but not least, I have the Director of Thematic Research, Head of Research Methodology and Development Division at the African Peer Review Mechanism, and that's Dr., if I can get it right here, McBride Kalamba. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you all for coming through. I think let's begin, first of all, by just reminding ourselves the key outcomes of the summit that we've just had in Addis Ababa. If I can come to you, Ambassador.
Well, thanks very much, Godfrey. I think the 33rd session of the AU will go down as one of the most seminal in the recent history of the African Union. This summit lent great political impetus to the process of the economic integration of Africa. But it also lent a great technical impetus to that process. And I'll explain just briefly. We know the significance of the CFTA because it brings together 55 African economies into a single market that is made up of 1.2 billion people with a combined GDP of over 3 trillion US dollars. And indeed, this is a very significant moment for Africa because for the first time, the continent will have an opportunity to trade freely with itself. We plan to reduce tariffs on over 90% of the goods and services that will be traded on the continent. This will significantly boost intra-Africa trade. It will indeed drive industrialization and will create a new dynamic in terms of boosting the productive capacity of African economies, thus creating jobs and contributing to the achievement of sustainable development goals, as well as Agenda 2063. At a technical level, it was a very significant summit in the sense that heads of states agreed on the head of the African Continental Free Trade Area, Secretariat, who is a South African. And indeed, we are extremely privileged and honored that one of our own will be at the head of the implementation of this very important continental project. We hope that with the finalization of all the outstanding issues, the CFTA will come into effect on the 1st of July this year. The other significant outcome was the decision by the heads of states to declare the decade 2020 to 2030 as the decade of women, economic and financial inclusion.
Sure.
This is very significant, noting that more than 60% of small and medium enterprises on the continent are run by women, yet women do not have a voice, neither do they have access to finance. So this is going to lend a major impetus to national efforts to create space for women, not only in small and medium enterprises, but also to enter the area of state procurement, as well as procurement in major industries, whether it's the extractive industries or other secondary sectors of the economy. This was very significant from the summit. Summit also agreed to look at areas of addressing the gender-based violence on the continent. And in this regard, we're going to engage with the Commission to pilot a convention that would create the necessary political framework for advocating the issue of the elimination of gender-based violence. Again, Summit endorsed the issue of women, peace and security. This year, as you know, is the 20th anniversary of UN Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. And South Africa has been playing a very key role in the training of mediators, women mediators, in various conflict areas, in the Sudan and so on. And indeed, we're going to take advantage of this broad political statement by the summit to hold a major event in August this year in honor of African women, but also to encourage the inclusion of women, because women bear the biggest brand in conflict situations.
I'm reminded of the song "Women Hold Up Half the Sky." I don't know if you are old enough to remember that one, I think. And I think it's an important point to make. So the summit had those wide-ranging goals that were enunciated at the end of it. I want to speak to one of them, and let's go to Addis for that, where we joined Tapiwa. So, Tapiwa, from an AU perspective, I wanted to find out from you, as sitting inside the Continental body, how you see this panning out as we go forward. Because I think one of the stats that I heard at the summit was that 60% of all the small businesses on the African continent are run by women. So they have gotten to this stage without clear formal support from the formal structures. Are we going to see a revolution now that we're hearing the heads of state talking about this, and also obviously, of course, the action that will be required at the national levels?
Well, thank you very much, Godfrey. Indeed, if you look at it, the African Union recognizes gender equality as a fundamental right, as well as an integral part of integration, regional integration. And if you look at it, as Osi highlighted, is that we are indeed pleased to see that the summit, the head of state declared that 2020 to 2030 is a new African Women's Decade, specifically on financial inclusion. Indeed, it's true, because this is embedded within the Agenda 2060, which...
Go on.
I'm hearing some I think. Okay, yeah. So within the Agenda 2063, which commits itself, in particular, has committed itself to look at it that, well, 20%, this 20% reduction of poverty among women by 2023, at the same time having 25% of all new enterprises on the continent are women-owned. Further, it commits itself to say that, well, 30% of all nationally generated procurements are competitively allocated to women. So this, we already have the Agenda 2063, which situates us and prepares us to move forward with that. So with the new decade being declared, I think we stand a chance that, well, the figures that you've mentioned of 60% that the women are, of course, with the support that has been from private sector and others, as a continent, together with the member states, regional economic commissions, we will be in a position to accelerate that so that we are in the process as well as on the right pathway of achieving Agenda 2063 as well as Sustainable Development Goals 2030. So indeed, this is a time that where, as African Union, of course, as mandated by the heads of states, that we will be sitting down trying to carve a roadmap in terms of realizing this Agenda 2063. Allow me also to mention that allow me also to mention that during, on the margins of the summit, together with the United Nations Economic Commission of Africa and the African Women's Leadership Leaders Network and the African Union, we launched the African Women's Leadership Fund, which is an innovative fund that is going to help accelerate, and have access to infrastructure as well as financial access by women African fund managers, so that they are in a position to support women in business and entrepreneurship.
Yeah, and I saw there were personal contributions that were made. I think President Paul Kagame made a personal contribution. President Cyril Ramaphosa promised to make. This is one time where I'm going to be politically correct, and I'm going to come to you, Claudia, and ask for your contribution in terms of that effort, that focus on trying to make sure that women are not just listening in, nor an appendage to the action that the African leaders are talking about, but are active participants. Your thoughts, please.
Well, it's really important that women participate in all spheres of the economy, not only politically, but economically as well. And one of the greatest focus of the AfCFTA, as Ambassador mentioned earlier, about bringing inclusivity and mutual benefits into the CFTA process. So it's about harmonization and collaboration and the coordination of a number of processes in the African Union through the AfCFTA, so giving that platform to women, small enterprises, private sector, informal businesses, really bringing them together, creating a platform where we can look at not only market integration and trading opportunities, export opportunities, but also a platform where women themselves can be investors in the future of the continent. I recently attended a session where there's a SADC Women in Business coalition that has been launched last year. And these women are business women. They are running major corporates in South Africa and Southern Africa, and they are really eager to play their role in the continental free trade area through contracts, through investment and exports into the rest of the continent.
Yeah, I was going to raise the issue of small businesses and their ability to be able to exploit the opportunities that we're talking about. Because we all know, it's easy for, shall we say, Barlow World or Anglo-American or one of those big, large corporates to be able to export. But it's harder for you. Now, we are saying, let's get you more in, but are we providing you the tools that will enable you, number one, to be competitive, and secondly, to get the advantage that we're seeking to advance to you as women?
Well, there's a continental strategy for the development of small and medium enterprises that is something that is really at the forefront of the continental agenda. But at the same time, it really depends on national governments to also prepare and integrate small businesses into the benefits that are going to be presented through the AfCFTA. So there's a number of incentives. There's a lot of export promotion activities, export-ready activities that the DTI, for example, offers to small businesses to really integrate them into the mainstream trading system. And of course, through the AfCFTA, which is largely a market integration initiative, the important pillars of infrastructure development and industrial development are key to the success thereof. So it's really about providing those opportunities and scope to ignite industrialization through the development and creation of regional value chains. If you look at where Africa is placed in terms of global value chains, we don't fare very highly. So it's really about how do we connect as African economies, how do we look at how these fragmented economies can come together into a single trading market, how do we cooperate, how do we provide capacity building so that the benefits are mutually shared across the continent.
Absolutely. Let me come to you, Dr. Nkalamba, because the President of South Africa, as he took over the chairmanship of the AU, spoke, and I quote here directly, of a new epoch, he said, of governance and leadership in Africa. And key and central to that is the African peer review mechanism. An organization that started with a lot of fanfare in terms of getting everybody involved, and then we saw some dithering because people are being asked difficult questions here. Here's an opportunity for you to update us, number one, in terms of the involvement of African countries in this, and also the progress that's been made to ensure this is not just talking and tick, 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 tick. This is actually practically changing the ground on governance in Africa.
Okay, thank you. So firstly, maybe let me highlight that for all these initiatives to work, whether you're talking about the Africa Free Continental Free Trade Area, silencing the guns. For all these initiatives, any protocol that is agreed upon to work, to be successful, you must address the question of governance.
Sure.
And that's what the African peer review mechanism was established to do in a number of areas. Political governance and democracy, economic governance and management, corporate governance, and sustainable social development policy. And since its establishment in 2003, it's a voluntary mechanism. Governments are supposed to join voluntarily. Since its establishment, we now have 40 countries of the 54 that have joined.
Okay.
Now, you may ask, so what exactly does the African peer review mechanism do that would not be necessarily done at a country level, at a national level? The instruments that are developed at the African Union, for instance, the protocol or the agreement on the Africa Free Continental Trade Area, necessarily demands that the countries that are members of the African Union have some sort of convergence in terms of their policies, standards, and codes.
Yeah.
If you're talking about connecting economies, there must be some convergence. There might be some common standards and values within which you relate. And the African peer review mechanism provides one very critical function. It is to undertake assessments throughout the countries that participate, now 40, examining how these countries have actually adhered to the standards, codes, and these conventions that are agreed upon at a continental level. You will agree with me that you cannot trade if you do not have common rules, if you do not common understanding of the institutions and the infrastructure that you need. So these assessments, the assessments rather that are undertaken by the African peer review mechanism are looking at exactly that. But what is critical, I mean, what is really distinct about the mechanism is that this conversation is not taking place at any other level, but at the highest level of policy making, at the level of the heads of
where
state.
the change needs to happen.
Where the leadership and the decisions ought to be. And the peer in the African peer review mechanism refers to the conversation the heads of state have at the APRM, which is the highest policy body of the African peer review mechanism, on the reports from each of these countries after these assessments on how these countries are progressing towards a particular objective, particular standard, a particular policy in the areas that I've mentioned, the 4 areas.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the conditions that were set. I don't know, I think you will remember definitely the European Union when it agreed to monetary union. There were those rules that were set, there were those conditions, those standards that must be met, as you mentioned here, that had to be met and adhered to for one to become a member. So the question we've always asked around the African peer review mechanism is there a way of ensuring that compliance, once agreed upon, becomes mandatory? In other words, if you fail to meet the conditions for governance, you get kicked out, or there's some kind of sanction. Does it have teeth?
That's well, that is not the role of the APRM, the African peer review mechanism. There are issues that are mediated within the Assembly, the African Union itself. The role of the African peer review mechanism is one very critical role: to provide accurate, credible, and legitimate account of governance in a particular country.
What happens if you don't provide that critical information that's required?
Well, you can't make the choices you need to make. You can't make the decisions you need to make. You can't have the quality of decisions you need to make. You need information in order to make those decisions and to make those choices. Now, there are 2 streams of work that the APRM is really involved in. The first is the assessment, a general overall assessment of a country across governance.
Right.
But we have also been given the mandate, we call it the extended mandate, to monitor Agenda 2063 and the SDGs, the governance aspects of these 2 frameworks. There are 2 of them in SDGs and there are 2 of them in Agenda 2063. We provide on a yearly basis an account of how countries are faring regarding those targets. And as I've said, these are central to delivery of any of these instruments that we have spoken of.
Okay, I'll park it there because I've got too many questions for you. Let me come to Dr. Petros de Kock here, representing Brand South Africa. And one of the points that was made by, there were many commentators there in the AU in Addis Ababa when South Africa took over the chairmanship of the African Union, the second time in 18 years, correct? Yes, and an opportunity for South Africa to follow in on the footsteps that have been made by others before it. Before it, before the president of Egypt took over as chairman, there was Paul Kagame. When now people speak about the legacy that Paul Kagame left the AU, they mention in particular two things. Number one, the institutional reform of the AU. Number two, the funding of the AU. And this whole question about donors funding us and then trying to dictate our targets and programs. The question people are asking about South Africa is, we had the ambassador line up all those things that are going to be tackled during the chairmanship of President Cyril Ramaphosa. Is South Africa, in this hour, setting itself too wide a target in terms of its achievements? What are you hoping to achieve in any case?
I think it's maybe a bit early to talk about legacy. We have the president, we have his position that he shared at the AU summit, but I think it's very important in this year where we have the appointment of the first Secretary General of the Free Trade Area being a South African with a particular kind of expertise. Now, I want to say that in the context of certain indicators, there's an index called the Open Budget Index, where South Africa ranked third out of 163 countries for our contribution to global peace and security, which specifically speaks to our role on the African continent. We're not the biggest contributor to peacekeeping operations by numbers, but however, the role of South Africa as an investor in the Pan-African economy, if you look at EY, we're the 5th largest source of FDI in the African economy. So the role of South Africa
You're
in
actually the biggest
African investor,
Africa,
yes.
From South Africa.
If you look at the profile of our exports, our colleague from the DTI, I think if I talk under correction, just under 50% of our manufactured goods that gets exported into the African economy. So from a South African perspective, this year is incredibly significant. But I want to go to quickly sideway to a global situation that we are facing.
Sure.
The African continent is actually at this point in time engaging in a counter-cyclical engagement of integration. If you look at the EU with Brexit, the breakaway of the UK from the EU, if you look at behavior from the United States in terms of withdrawing from global trade agreements, instigating trade wars, withdrawing from multilateral engagements in peace and security, like from the Iran nuclear deal, for example, the African continent and the BRICS in particular, where South Africa is a critical player in each one of those platforms, is illustrating something of a very different thinking and approach to multilateral affairs that's coming from the developing world. And the African continent at this point in time, I think the Continental Free Trade Area is not a luxury for us. It will become a critical feature of human development on the continent. And when the colleague from the APRM was talking, when you look at the Ibrahim Index of African Governance, for example,
yes,
also absolutely critical instrument for us as Africans to pay much more attention to. Because ultimately we talk about employment, we talk about empowerment, we talk about all these things, but the nuts and bolts of actually driving societal and human development forward on this continent depends on having strong infrastructure and institutions to drive those things forward. So I think from a South African perspective, in this year building a legacy, the two things will be success in the initial phases of beginning the nuts and bolts implementation of the free trade area.
Yes.
But then also from a South African capability point of view, I think South Africans sometimes we're a bit blind to the capacity of South Africa when it comes to our corporates active in the continent, our state-owned enterprises like a Transnet, for example. And the reason why I mentioned that is we've got tremendous expertise to contribute positively towards that long-term objective of integration.
But it's a delicate balance, isn't it? Because the leadership that South Africa needs to show on the continent needs to be tempered by the realization that there is also a sense from outside the continent that South Africa sometimes comes across as a bully. The DTI has taken a number of forays into the African continent, trying to promote South African products. I think their stories might be interesting in terms of the reception, but I wanted to pose that question to the ambassador because that is what you speak to, isn't it? That's what you do on a daily basis in your day job.
Yes. Well, thanks very much.
How do you make that balance? I think that's really my question.
Well, thanks very much. No, I think South Africa's credentials and intentions on the continent are very much well accepted as being sincere and genuine in its commitment to Pan-African integration and of course in the role that it is playing generally in the promotion of peace and security, stability, creating conditions for Africa's development. So I don't think there's any doubt, there are any contradictions in terms of our national posture as well as our the external expression of that posture on the continent. I think it is well accepted, and indeed the the election of a South African to be the first head of the secretariat of the AfCFTA is testament to that, the fact that South
It was a
Africa,
keen fight, though, wasn't it?
there was, it was a contest.
Good contest,
It was a
friendly fight.
It was a contest, and eventually the whole continent won. Eventually, all of us united around the candidate that received the majority of the votes. It was by acclamation by heads of states. So nobody is licking their wounds. We all now united behind this project of the integration of the African continent. And maybe just to raise a point around the issue of governance that you were asking about. We've taken the position, and this has been accepted by the Assembly of Heads of States of the AU, that we need to move towards the universal ratification or accession into the APRM. So all African countries have to join the APRM. This is an important statement,
Sure.
because it reaffirms their commitment to democracy and good governance. And we've said that by 2023, we want all African countries to have acceded to the APRM.
Yeah.
This is one of the targets that President Ramaphosa has set himself.
But you must answer to the question that I also raised with him, isn't it?
Yeah.
About, sure, you can make everybody a member, but if everyone is not following the rules, the key question that we keep asking is, are there enough mechanisms there to make sure that those who do not follow the rules have some kind of sanction? Or is sanction not the African way to approach these things?
The philosophy that underpins the APRM is not a philosophy that is predicated on punishment. It's predicated on encouragement and assisting countries to progressively achieve certain standards. And we've seen that, we've seen progress insofar as that in a number of countries ever since the inception of the APRM.
Yeah.
So its philosophy is fundamentally different. And you must remember, Africa is the only continent that has got an instrument such as the peer review mechanism.
True.
No other continental
Though we have a
body,
larger deficit as well, you could argue, but I could take your point.
but we've made progress.
Yes.
Because we started on a very low base. And if you look at the progress we've made now in terms of the number of countries that are having regular elections, the number of transformations or transitions that are more peaceful.
From
There's
one
an
opposition party to...
Absolutely. We've got much
party,
more peaceful transitions of power on the continent.
Yeah.
Not through the barrel of the gun,
Yeah.
but through the ballot.
That
And
we
this
must
is very
love.
significant.
Absolutely, we must congratulate that. You wanted to come in quickly before. I want to bring the conversation to this AfCFTA. July 1 is around the corner.
Just a quick comment on the issue of South Africa's profile on the continent. It came up in part of your question. You know, we've been conducting quite extensive research in a number of African markets on basically South Africa's profile or South Africa's presence in peer markets, where we would look at private sector activity, state-owned enterprise activity, diplomatic activity, etc. And we've done work on market entry strategy from a South African perspective. And the way that we find South Africans and South African corporates are received in peer African markets is actually much more positive, I think, than what we see sometimes. We tend to see negative headlines. MTN has trouble in Nigeria, or there's an issue here or there. However, I think the number of tremendous case studies of South African corporates making a real and concrete difference in African markets, and how that has played a role in oftentimes even shaping particular sectors of activity in a market. I think there's a lot of work to be done on that in terms of understanding 25 years post-1994, how we have not only turned away from pariah of the world into a tremendously positive force in economies.
Yeah, I was going to say, we don't always write negative headlines. We do write good headlines as well. Yesterday, prime example, in Kenya yesterday, ABSA came up and said, a new app that the bank has created after taking over the Barclays assets has attracted 5 million users from about 3 million before the bank became ABSA Bank. We follow the news. We do not just want negative headlines. Right. Let's center the conversation on the matter of the moment, which of course is the African Continental Free Trade Area and the formal start of trading on July 1. Tapiwa, can I come to you in Addis for your perspective on the readiness? Yes, you can speak from a gender perspective, but I just wanted to cover in general the readiness of the African continent and those countries that are already signed up to begin trading on July 1. I had an interview with the head of the Trade Department of the AU, Ambassador Muchanga, and he told me of the work that's being done, the technical work that is continuing on the ground, and also the political will that is behind it. Let's re-emphasize again what we're trying to get out of here.
Well, of course, it's true that, well, the AfCFTA as it's on board, and then we're trying to look at how ready as well. We should be looking at how ready the women themselves are in terms of leveraging on the AfCFTA as it is currently. So we're looking at issues that we need to eliminate, barriers that impede on the economic side as well as doing business with the women. If you look at it, of course, there are already women who are engaged in the cross-border trade. That's where we've got millions, billions of money that it's generating from cross-border trade. So the women, of course, do meet different challenges, be it of tariffs, issues of security and safety. And these are things that we also need to be looking into, because we do not want to leave anybody behind. So women needs to be included in that. So we're trying to work with member states as well as regional economic bodies in trying to ensure that, well, all, we eliminate all barriers in trading, among us, cross-border trade. But at the same time, I would also want to look at it that, well, we need to look also in terms of the problems that are associated with credit solutions, that are in place at the moment. We need to make sure that we create conducive environment in terms of creating access to new credit solutions that are targeting the women. And we have also to look at generating access to infrastructure in terms of the downstream processing as well as distribution in the process of entrepreneurship. At the same time, why not also looking at training the women in agro-industry technologies? Because this is something that we also need to be ready and looking forward if we are indeed to ensure that there's women and there's women financial as well as economic inclusion. So hence, as a continent, not only the African Union Commission, but through the member states and the regional communities, as well as the private sector, we have to work hand in hand so that we're in a position to realize that indeed women and economic empowerment is achievable on the continent. And that is the realization of Agenda 2063 that we all aspire to on the continent.
There's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I see you guys also want to come in and contribute here. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. But before you make your point, Ambassador, I just wanted to say, one of the key things that she talks about is involving more women at a formal level. And this is where the challenge comes in, isn't it? Because we know a lot of the trade that takes place between African countries, particularly around the borders, is informal. I want to know the initiatives that are being undertaken there. Then she didn't mention one other thing that ought to be tackled, and I think it affects us all. Corruption. We got to tackle it. We all know when you pass through those borders, if your pockets are not bulging, you will struggle. I mean, I can attest to that kind of challenge at the Bridge border post. Let's not hide about it. There's a big challenge there. Quickly make your point, Ambassador, then let's spread the conversation to everyone here.
Very briefly, thanks very much. Now, the question is, what are the outstanding issues?
This is from a country level?
No, from a continental level, around the CFTA.
Okay.
And what is the roadmap? Now, the outstanding issues are your rules of origin, tariff schedules, dispute resolution, trade in services. These are the few outstanding issues.
And those sound like some of the most critical.
Indeed, they are quite technical, they're critical, but progress has been made on these issues. And heads of states have said that by the end of April, we must have concluded on these issues.
Sure.
That is our first milestone, if you like, in terms of the first phase this year. The next milestone is May 2020. And on this occasion, South Africa will host an extraordinary summit of the AU, which will focus on the AfCFTA. This extraordinary summit will adopt the outcomes of the technical work, which will be recommended by the ministers of trade on these issues that are outstanding, which will then pave the way for the implementation of the CFTA come 1 July 2020. So that is the roadmap.
It is complicated, it is heavy work. It's one time I don't wish I was a politician. I'm sure you're champing at the bit because you want to talk about the opportunities that we're likely to see here from a South African perspective. We speak often about how South Africa is the most industrialized country on the continent, but I want you to speak to the challenges as well that we've been raising as part of this discussion, the formalization, the corruption issues.
Well, there's going to be a number of challenges in the implementation of the agreement, and I think what we need to consider and take into account is that, number one, there is tremendous political will behind the AfCFTA.
Agreed. For the first time, we have to say.
Well, it's very, very...
I will say, because I've been covering the African continent for the past 35 years, I can tell you, this is the first time I've seen a focus, in particular, on the economic issues.
Well, if you look at the number of countries that have ratified,
100%.
we've got 28 countries that have ratified in a matter of less than a year. So the political commitment as well as the technical commitment to deliver an unprecedented free trade area of this size for the continent, to integrate African markets, to deal with underproduction structures, etc., that Ambassador mentioned, is there. But of course, the agreement entered into force last year. That's what they call the operationalization of the AfCFTA in July. That meant that the legal instrument, the agreement, came into force. And in this case, the political will has outpaced our ability to conclude some of those negotiations. You will recall that as South Africa, we negotiate on goods as a member of the Southern African Customs Union, for example. So we would make an offer as a customs union to those trading partners that we do not have a preferential trading arrangement with. On services, we're looking at extending some of the priority sectors, in terms of the priority sectors that we have identified, looking at making offers on those sectors, which would be a basis for the negotiation. But I think what is critical, as Ambassador mentioned, in terms of the outstanding work, is the rules of origin. And what we're trying to promote is really a Made in Africa brand. So what you don't want is transshipment and goods coming from outside of the continent that then benefit from the trading preferences under this AfCFTA. So those tariff schedules that Ambassador was talking about, the conclusion thereof is really linked to our ability to conclude those rules of origin. So you know exactly what are the preferences, how a product will be treated under the AfCFTA. So that will take us then to a May extraordinary summit where we adopt that outstanding work. On rules of origin, it really is about 3 critical chapters that that is outstanding. It's not all of the rules of origin, so it is quite some work, but it's almost there. There's already work being done in terms of the tariff offers. Then, of course, once those rules of origin are confirmed, we'll be able to exchange those, negotiate them, and finalize them. And then after the summit, that will take us into the commencement of the second phase of the negotiation. So the AfCFTA is not really about, it's a market integration agreement, but it's really a comprehensive agreement that aims to unlock all the other opportunities, whether it's governance, investment rules, how do we cooperate in terms of customs harmonization procedures, especially those issues you're talking about, corruption, how do you avoid that? But now if you've got some sort of coordinated customs procedure, documentation that is aligned.
Like the proposal to make the border post a one border post from 2023.
Right, so it's about really building capacity of customs authorities, coordinating in terms of implementation on how we ensure that the goods move across and the services move across the borders easily. There's rules and processes and provisions in the agreement that will tell you exactly how to treat and how to process an issue where there isn't consensus on how to get some of those goods across the borders. It really relies on bilateral cooperation, and of course, one of the important aspects of the AfCFTA is that there's a dispute settlement mechanism attached to it, which is detached to an extent from the border organs of the AU, It's a real technical exercise. It's not in the political ambit.
Yeah.
And it's really about finding a quick and easy resolution to some of those trade disputes.
Yeah, I want the other guys to come in as well. I realize we're talking out of your areas of comfort, but you want to come in?
Yeah, I think this is where you see that the role of the APRM is indispensable. When you talk of corruption, addressing corruption means that you have to look at public institutions. It's about strengthening public institutions. You are strengthening accountability institutions, you are strengthening the sectors that deliver, that they have the necessary legislation and the necessary systems. All these are domains of governance. But you also want to ensure that there is participation across the sectors for accountability. And the APRM process does just that. The critical actor in all this equation is the state.
Yes.
And we all appreciate that each state is a sovereign state. I mean, as Ambassador had indicated here, that the pronouncement is that by 2023, all countries should join the APRM voluntarily. Yeah. And that's because they're sovereign states, they need to participate voluntarily.
For sure.
But it is within this process, the mechanism, that you begin to address the issue of institutions. Now, South Africa, as a most industrialized economy and most developed in a number of aspects.
Let's put it this way, more goods to trade with Africa than the other countries.
Exactly, but also most industrialized.
Yes.
And I think with fairly much more developed public institutions and a much more vibrant democracy.
Though
you can
they
argue, but
trade.
they have, South Africa has a lot to offer.
Sure.
And I just want to highlight that within the APRM process, one of the key value addition is the sharing, the experience sharing, taking lessons from this part of the continent, that state to the other. And this is what you need to have these institutions across the continent develop. And you cannot address corruption just by political will. It's a catalyst, but you need to go beyond political will to look at, as he had indicated, the nuts and bolts. And that's what's being addressed within the African peer review mechanism.
Absolutely. You want to come in, Petrus?
You know, something that interests me and that connects with our colleague from the DTI, President Ramaphosa, since his first State of the Nation address, he's been emphasizing the issue of ease of doing business in the South African context. Now, I think as we discussed very deep technical issues, one-stop border posts, clearance procedures, harmonization of policy, etc., I think there's a much bigger debate we would also inevitably need to enter into as a free trade area, is ease of doing business.
Yes, of course.
In the region. And that will, I think, the learnings that we have already, for example, there's the statement we tend to make, African solutions to African problems. Now, for example, East African community has been tremendously advanced over the years in terms of integration in the region.
Overtaking SADC, let me put it that way.
Phenomenal progress that the East African community has been making. So why did I say African solutions to African problems? We can learn from ourselves.
Sure.
In terms of how did the East African community arrive in a relatively short period of time. Because if you look at the political will and drive in the community to unlock the potential that lies in the region, I think we really need to take, as the APRM, as institutions, we need to look inward. And also you made a comment earlier on informal trade on the continent. I remember in the years, I was active quite a lot in Sudan's with the years of the Southern Sudan's independence in Khartoum, Juba, and I spent a lot of time in the region. And you know what fascinated me in Southern Sudan? People tend to think Southern Sudan, newly independent country, but then you're shocked when you get there, when you look at the movement of people from the region and the kind of business, informal business that's done. But ultimately, when you start adding up all that activity, the tremendous drive, and the point I want to make, I think the political leadership is only catching up with what has always been happening on the continent.
That's a good point.
At a certain level. Now, can I make another point?
Quickly.
A number of years ago, there was an instrument financed by MasterCard. It was called the African Cities Competitiveness Index or something like that.
I know it.
And a very specific point I want to make, fascinating data from there. We tend to think of the big centers on the continent, Nairobi, Lagos, Johannesburg, etc. But when you start geographically mapping the continent, how do people move between regional centers, small towns? What are the actual routes that people have been using for centuries on this continent to trade. Now the question becomes, yes, at a technical level, we need policy, we need harmonization, but what are we doing to understand the actual natural flow of people and goods on this continent, and then start asking the question, where do we need the infrastructure? Where do we need the railway lines? Where do we need the 5G infrastructure to support a natural phenomenon already? So I think we need to be, as institutions and states, very open to our societies and follow the trend that's already existing. And I think in that way, we can catalyze a lot more of the Pan-African economic integration process than we can imagine as we sit here.
It speaks to one of the solutions that I had at a previous workshop that spoke about integration in Africa. This whole idea around corridors where the trade is taking place across the African continent, and the need to build those corridors and change the infrastructure that was put in place by the colonialists, because it served a totally different purpose. I wanted to go back slightly before I ask you to all think about what you want to say as we wrap up. I wanted to go back to the issue of the negotiations, the work that needs to be done, Ambassador, that you spoke about, that remains to be completed before that extraordinary summit in May. And I wanted to ask, frankly, how difficult are those negotiations? I'm sure the Ambassador can talk to that, but I'm sure you can also talk to that.
Well, they're not easy negotiations. Number one, they're very technical. You're negotiating amongst 55 African economies, different levels of development. We're talking about national interests predominantly. We're talking about the pursuit of regional integration, but in such a manner that it's not just about market integration that benefits one or two countries in the continent. It's really about making sure that we bring everybody on board and the costs and benefits are shared amongst all African economies. So they are tough negotiations, they are technical negotiations, but they're essential. And I think part of what is going to create the success in this is that there is that will and the common drive to achieve this. And we will get there. We don't have much time, as the heads of state have given us, but we have a very intense work program to achieve some of these results. And we definitely, the objective is to meet the target to start trading on the 1st of July as directed by the heads of state. And of course that would include both goods and services across the continent. But yes, they are difficult.
I saw how difficult they were when we were in Addis. I mean, we were waiting for the final document to be issued, and I heard that final document came out in the AMs. And we saw the other day Nigeria declaring it will not join unless X and X and X is done. Ambassador, just your contribution very quickly.
Yes. No, I think there's a tremendous amount of goodwill in concluding the negotiations in good time. And I think we must applaud our negotiating teams for having made this tremendous progress up to so far. Because if you look at the EU, for example, it took them decades to negotiate a free trade agreement in the context of the EU. With African countries, it has taken us just a few years to really knuckle down and come to the conclusion of a major, a very historic agreement that will have a huge impact in the continental integration process. So I think the progress is commendable, and we're hopeful that by the end of April, all these issues would have been ironed out. You asked the question, what would be our legacy? Three things.
I guess those are your closing thoughts. Thank you, Ambassador.
Yes, three issues. President Ramaphosa will go down in history as the head of state who would have presided over the implementation of the first phase of the CFTA.
Successfully, so hopefully.
Indeed, this is very significant because, as you know, he is already recognized as a champion of African economic renewal. Africa's economic renaissance is going to be one of the enduring legacies of President Ramaphosa. The second is women economic and financial inclusion. Very critical. He's the first head of state to have taken this issue to this very high level and to have mobilized and captured the imagination of people, not just on the continent, but globally, around the imperative to address the issue of women economic and financial inclusion, particularly in this year, which is the 30th anniversary of the Beijing platform. Very significant. The third key enduring legacy, as you know, President Ramaphosa comes from a background of trade unionism, as a negotiator, as a mediator. He has played a significant role in moving the Sudan peace process forward. Last week in Addis, he met separately with both President Salva Kiir and Riek Machar. And following that nifty negotiation work, we've seen that President Salva Kiir announced last week Saturday that the government of South Sudan has decided to compromise with regards to the outstanding issue around the number of states that will constitute the transitional government of South Sudan. This is a major development, and indeed we do hope that the opposition and other parties will embrace this gesture of magnanimity and statesmanship by President Salva Kiir, so that South Sudan can have peace, and indeed its people can be part and parcel of this new era that is dawning on the continent, of its Africa, of its renewal, of its development, which paves the way for its prosperity.
Absolutely, and we shall be writing the history. Ambassador, thank you very much. Let's go to Addis for Tapiwa to give you final thoughts before we come back to Johannesburg. Tapiwa?
Well, allow me just to conclude by saying that as we're working in terms of improving as well as shaping the new decade of financial, women's financial as well as economic inclusion, let me echo what our champion on gender and development issues in Africa said during his address at the Assembly. That's the president of Nana Akufo-Addo of Ghana, who mentioned, and this is our wish as well as for the African Union Commission, the Directorate of Women and Gender Directorate, is that we are very hopeful that 2020 it's going to be a gap closing year that takes Africa, into the great state of improving on our, collective performance in, promoting gender equality. Allow me also to mention that we would be also calling upon, on the political mobilization of the current chair, that's Africa, in terms of where we still have a gap in terms of having some of 13 African countries who haven't ratified the Maputo Protocol. That would be calling upon, and that is something very, very useful that would be calling upon, because out of 55, it's only 42 who've ratified. So we cannot be talking of financial inclusion, economic inclusion, when we know that, well, our legal instruments haven't been ratified on the continent, because 2020, as the AU, we declared it as a universal declaration of the ratification of Maputo Protocol itself. So this is something that we'll be calling upon, and we know that, well, we'll be looking forward to every member state, trying to champion, the new decade as it is currently.
Great, thank you. Lady, gentlemen, you realize I'm short of time.
Yes, but very, very, very importantly, because we're discussing trade here, trade is interaction. We have spoken of corridors. We have talked about informal cross-border traders. It's interaction. It's movement of goods, not just goods, but also movement of people. We have a protocol on the free movement of people. I think that this is one of the very key instruments that
I'm still waiting for my African passport.
Yes, yes. This is really key to getting the agreement working. And we have this year, in the second quarter, the APRM, and with the recognition of the South African government and leadership, we have organized a conference on African migration to address the issues around the issues of free movement of people. It's critical. We are not going to have all these gains and all these results we have pronounced here if we do not have that openness and interaction within the continent. So I wanted to end by saying that that's a very critical governance instrument that we all have to have a conversation around, and it is acceptance statement. President Ramaphosa has actually indicated that we need to deepen the conversations at that level on these challenges. I mean, as you are aware, it's one of the contentious issues, but it needs to be addressed.
Gotcha.
No, thank you, Godfrey. I think what I'd like to say in conclusion is that if you look at the current global trade dynamics and multilateralism, I think we have a collective duty to make the AfCFTA work as part of the Agenda 2063. It's one of the critical flagship projects. But it's going to require a collective commitment, and it's not just by government as the enablers, but by stakeholders that will actually benefit and be key to the implementation of the agreement. So while we're all waiting with bated breath for what the outcomes of the technical negotiations would be, there's a lot of work that we need to do in terms of the other supportive pillars of the AfCFTA, and that's really about cross-border infrastructure and unlocking the industrialization potential in the continent.
Absolutely. Petrus, you have the last kick.
You know what I'm interested in? Actually, in March, we hosting a session in Accra with the University of Ghana Business School, particularly on the issue of the free trade area and the Pan-African brand. I think as member states of the Continental Free Trade Area, each state will now also have to start thinking differently. How do I position and take the message on my country as well as the free trade area forward in a very hostile global environment where there's not just, people are talking about slowbalization. You know, we're not in an era of globalization anymore. We in a downward trend of global trade. We are being hammered with a very negative global economic and geopolitical outlook. So I think the responsibility of us as Africans, business, government, civil society, academia, will ultimately be to understand not just the nuts and bolts of how are we going to actualize this, but how do we take the message, the image of an integrating continent that's actually countering a lot of global fragmentary dynamics to the fore. So that would be my closing thought.
And I was going to say that I wonder when it will be that I'll be able to fly to, shall we say, every African capital city and get my visa on arrival. And I also wanted to say, so, you know, sometimes I wonder how difficult these negotiations could be if the colonialists had not parceled out Africa in 1884 the way they did, and there were natural boundaries. Maybe a lot easier. But let me thank my guests for our program today, the outcomes of the 33rd session of the African Union Heads of State Summit that took place in Addis. Ambassador Mxolisi Nkosi, thank you, sir, for coming in as Deputy Director General Global Governance and Continental Agenda of South Africa. Now we also have Dr. Petrus de Kock, General Manager Research at Brand SA, Claudia Furiel, Director at NEPAD at SSDTI, and Dr. Mabride Kalamba, Head of Research at the APRM Secretariat. And in Addis, the capital political of Africa, Tapiwa Nyasulu, Head Gender Analysis and Monitoring Division. Thank you for joining us via the airwaves, and thank you to all. Thank you for watching and listening. Until next time, goodbye from all of us.